Hello everyone, I'm Aileen Carroll, your friendly neighborhood sommelier with Lynfred Winery. Thank you all so much for joining me today for my guided virtual tour of our red blend tasting kit featuring our 2016 Touriga Nacional, our 2016 Teroldego-Petite Syrah, and our 2017 Assemblage. All of these wines are made with more than one grape varietal. As you can tell, I've already thoroughly, arduously researched them for you. The fact that they're all blends will give us a really cool chance to dive deeper into all of the different unique aspects of the individual grapes that contribute to these blends. Because as we'll see, those get to add things like complexity and balance to the final blend. I'll also be offering some tips and tricks as how you can improve your tasting palate to be able to pick up on these different nuances that the individual grapes are contributing. We'll also talk about how to improve your palate to be able to pick out the use of oak in a wine, and of course I'll be explaining a little bit about the history of wine blending, as well as explaining the two different methods that can be used to blend wine, because there's actually more than one. So we've got a lot of really cool things to learn and drink today. Let's get started. I do want to start out by saying a little bit about why a winemaker might choose to create a blended wine and why we as consumers might choose to enjoy one. The two terms that are actually pretty substantial in the wine world, because they're considered to be two things that make a wine truly great, and they're also reasons you might want to create and then enjoy a blended wine. Those terms are complexity and balance. To explain complexity, think back to when you were first getting into wine. You probably liked wines that were mostly fruit forward, very smooth, considered easy to drink, although I haven't met too many wines I don't consider easy to drink, but nevertheless, most people just getting into wine prefer wines that are almost just like grape juice. They're pretty one note, but then as our palate advances and our tastes develop, we want to have a taste for something that's a little more interesting than just grape juice. We seek out earthy flavors, floral notes. We want something with a little bit more interest, a little more depth. That's a wine that's complex. Obviously, if you take a wine made from a grape that's a little more fruity, blend it with a wine made from a grape that's a little more earthy, and then add one that has a floral component, the whole is going to be greater than the sum of its parts. You'll end up with a deliciously complex wine. So that's the first reason why blended wines are desirable. The second reason is a little more technical, and it involves a term called balance. When it comes to wine, there are 4 structural aspects that we want to have in perfect harmony and balance with each other. Those 4 terms are tannin, acid, fruit, and alcohol. Let's explain all of those. In order to get clear on what the terms tannin and acid mean, we'll have to take a little step back and separate those from a term that does tend to get used a bit ambiguously, and that term is dry. I want us to think of dry as just an aspect of taste. All that the term dry means is that a wine doesn't taste sweet. That's it. That's all it means. So basically all red wine is dry because it's not sweet. On the other hand, think of tannin and acid as aspects of a wine's texture as opposed to its taste. Tannin is the aspect of a wine that makes your mouth feel a little bit dried out. You can see now it tends to get confused with the term dry, because dry is a wine that doesn't taste sweet, whereas tannin is an aspect of wine that makes your mouth feel dry. But just keep thinking of it as a textural term as opposed to taste, and you should be able to keep them clear. Acid, like tannin, is also a textural component of wine, separated out from the idea of the taste of something sour, and think just about mouthfeel. Imagine a nice sour glass of lemonade. It tastes sour, but it has this feeling of making your mouth water. It makes your mouth produce saliva, it's thirst quenching. That's the effect of acid in a wine. We have acid on one side of the spectrum, tannin on the other, and we can see pretty clearly why you would want to have these two structural aspects basically in balance. You don't want a wine that's so acidic that it's like just drinking lemonade, but you also don't want a wine that is so tannic that it makes your tongue feel like sandpaper. In addition to acid and tannin being in balance, we also want to have those balanced with fruit and alcohol. Thinking back to those really simple wines that kind of just taste like grape juice, not only are they lacking depth and complexity, but they're lacking this aspect of balanced structure. They don't really have that bit of backbone that gives them balance. Fruit's very smooth, almost sweet, so the alcohol aspect of wine provides a bit of a structural backbone, balancing out all that smooth fruit. Again, we want to have acid, tannin, fruit, and alcohol all in balance in our wine. Speaking of alcohol, let's finally get to our first wine, which is our 2016 Touriga Nacional. Touriga Nacional is the most famous, widely planted, most revered grape of Portugal, and it is in fact the grape used in port. In this particular blend, we have 90% Touriga Nacional, we have 6% Petit Verdot, and 4% Petite Syrah. Touriga Nacional on its own is extremely fruity, extremely tannic, and pretty high in alcohol. It's also pretty high in acid, so it's a really big, bold wine. We can see why our winemakers might choose to add a couple of different elements in there because, as we learned, we want to have fruit, acid, alcohol, and tannin all in balance. The second grape that we have added here, Petit Verdot, is not too well known, but it's really historically important because it's one of the 5 main grapes in the famous classic Bordeaux blend, along with Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, as well as Carmenere. The reason Petit Verdot is added to the Bordeaux blend is the same reason that it's added to our delicious Touriga blend here. It adds a really nice deep color, and unlike the Touriga, which is mostly just fruity, Petit Verdot has this really characteristic, lovely floral aroma to it, like violets and lilac. So we can see, or we can expect that that'll add some complexity. Finally, we have Petite Syrah in the blend here. Petite Syrah is an excellent blending grape because it has these really unique non-fruit flavors of like chocolate, espresso, coffee. So obviously that'll be contributing to the complexity as well. Let's test our patience and just have a sniff before we enjoy a sip of our Touriga here. So starting with the non-fruit flavors, we have definitely that violet flower aroma coming from the Petit Verdot. It can be a little bit hard to pick out non-fruit aromas, specifically like floral aromas, because hopefully we do encounter fruit on a pretty regular basis, but we don't always stop and smell the flowers. I would recommend doing that, but in the meantime, here's a little tip as to how you can improve your ability to pick out floral aromas in wine. If you're getting some sense that there's a floral aspect present, but you can't quite put your finger on which, just ask your imagination if you can see like what color flower it seems to smell like. Certainly your brain will be able to say there's a difference between what a white flower and a red flower smells like. Here, just like the deep violet color, it's definitely a purple kind of smelling flower, and then just think of all the flowers you can think of that are that color. Not too many purple flowers. We have violet and lilac, so that's kind of a way you can hone in on different floral smells. You can use that same color trick if you need a little bit of help picking out the fruit aromas too. So with red wine, our fruit color categories are going to fall mostly into one or two of these four: red fruit, purple fruit, blue fruit, and black fruit. Returning to our Touriga here, I'd say we're mostly in the kind of purple and black fruit category, so we can just think of all the purple and black fruits we can think of. Again, not too many. We have plum, blackberry, black cherry, black raspberry. Go back to your wine and ask your imagination which of those seems to stick out the most. I would say mostly black cherry, certainly plum, and for me, blackberry as well. We're gonna get to taste in a minute. I just want you to notice maybe one other thing on the nose here, and it's kind of an aroma of vanilla and cedar. I won't keep you waiting. We'll explain that later. Just notice it for now. Cheers. So I think those violet flower aspects from the Petit Verdot are definitely shining through to begin. Then we have similar fruit flavors to the nose, the black cherry, really nice blackberry, and definitely that rich plum, which is coming across almost like a prune aspect. That might be because this wine has just a little bit of age on it. Those other non-fruit flavors that we mentioned, the vanilla and the cedar, see if you can pick those out as well. Those will be interesting because, as I'll explain, they're not coming from the grapes themselves, but from a totally different aspect. Lastly, coming from the grapes here, you should be able to taste and almost feel a little bit of that texture of like cocoa powder or ground coffee beans, and that is coming from the Petite Syrah. So we definitely have a complex wine here. Let's remember back to our structural terms and ask about how balanced it is. So it makes our mouth water a little bit. We have that acid component, but then a good amount of that tannic backbone, putting it in balance. It is a little bit more on the acidic end of the balanced part of the spectrum. And a wine that's balanced doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. We want to leave room for wines that you like, leave room for your taste. So if you prefer something that's a little bit on the juicier side of the spectrum, there's really no right or wrong answer, so long as we do have that complexity and balance in there for the most part. Moving on to our 2016 Teroldego-Petite Syrah. Teroldego is a grape that's native to northeastern Italy, specifically the province of Trentino Alto Adige, which is just fun to say. We do have 65% Teroldego in this blend, as well as 35% Petite Syrah. Teroldego characteristics include, similar to Touriga, being very fruit forward, mostly with blackberry and black raspberry notes, and then it is a little bit more on the acidic end of the spectrum. So to add balance and complexity, the 35% Petite Syrah is added for those interesting non-fruit flavors, and also for the fact that Petite Syrah is much more on the tannic end of the spectrum, so that's going to create a nice harmonious texture and balance. Starting off again by investigating our fruit aromas. Say we're in the kind of blue and black fruit color category here. So not too many blue fruits, definitely blueberry, blackberry, maybe a little bit of black raspberry, and there's kind of, again, that vanilla and cedar aspect, which I'll explain after we taste. Don't want to keep you too thirsty. And then we can say that we're smelling a bit of that Petite Syrah, dark chocolate, coffee aromas as well. Cheers again. So definitely a lot of prominent toasted notes on top of those fruit and non-fruit characteristics that we already mentioned. The blackberry, that bit of like a dark chocolate texture, which is really interesting. But then we have all kinds of toasted, caramely vanilla notes, which are interesting because they're not coming from any of the grapes that are in the blend, but they're coming from the results of winemaking choices, specifically the choice to age this wine in oak. In fact, all three of these wines are aged in oak for at least 2 years, but I didn't want to explain that before because I wanted us to enjoy these glasses of wine. One good way to improve your palate in its ability to pick out whether or not a wine has been aged in oak is to focus on basically those three flavors that we already mentioned: vanilla, cedar or oak for lack of a better word, and then a kind of toasted caramelized aspect. The reason that wines that have been aged in oak have these flavor components is that vanillin is a natural flavor compound found in oak, just like in vanilla, which is what gives vanilla its flavor. So as a wine hangs out in an oak barrel, the flavor of vanilla is naturally going to seep into the wine itself, as well as, of course, those cedar, or for lack of a better word, oaky flavors that we're getting here. And then you may not know that all new barrels that are used for aging wine are toasted. just like a barrel that's going to be used to age bourbon. So I think it's pretty nifty to know the difference between flavors that are coming from the grapes versus flavors that are coming from other aspects of winemaking choices. One thing that I didn't mention, also because I didn't want to keep you thirsty, is that even though they're all blends, they're all aged in oak, there is a really key difference in method as to how these different blended wines are produced. The method of blending wine that most people are familiar with is the method that was used to make our first wine, the Touriga Nacional. And that method is to just take different grape varieties, ferment them separately into wine, and then taste all of them, decide what you're going for in the final blend, do some experiments with different ratios, blend it all together, and there's your blended wine. This is called the cuvée method, which is just a fancy way of saying blend in French. And it is the method that most people are familiar with, but it's actually not the only one, and it's not the oldest. So historically, like ancient historically, before we had the in-depth scientific understanding of the subtle differences between different types of grapes that we do today, there would be a whole bunch of different varietals growing next to each other in the vineyards, and people would just pick all these different kinds of grapes alongside each other, throw them all together to ferment at once to create a wine. Our Teroldego-Petite Syrah is made in this method, which is called co-fermentation. Again, the technical difference between them is that the cuvée method involves separately fermenting all the individual wines and then blending them together, whereas the co-fermentation method involves fermenting those different grapes actually together, producing a blended wine. I'm sure you're just dying to know what the different benefits are to the different methods of creating a blended wine, and they of course relate back to our themes of balance and complexity. The cuvée method, because a winemaker has all those different wines separate, they can taste each of them individually, experiment with different ratios, and that allows them a great deal of control in creating a really balanced final product, because you can taste the acid of one, the tannin of another, and have all that in perfect calculated harmony. The co-fermentation, on the other hand, doesn't give the winemaker quite as much control because the results are slightly more unpredictable. But the benefit of the co-fermentation method is the same benefit that stew has. Might sound like a weird example, but if you think about stew, if you were to take meat, potatoes, vegetables, and sauce, cook them all separately, and then blend them together, that wouldn't have quite the same harmonious texture and integrated flavors as if you were to actually stew them all together. Same principle applies to a co-fermented wine. When you take, like in this case, the Teroldego and Petite Syrah, ferment them together, that gives the flavors a long time to get integrated with each other and will produce, of course, a very complex wine, but will also produce a wine that has a really harmonious texture to it. Our final wine, our 2017 Assemblage, is also made in this ancient, interesting co-fermentation method. In our Assemblage, we have 54% Petite Syrah, 38% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 8% Syrah. We've been talking about Petite Syrah. In fact, it's found in all three of our blends, and it is a big favorite among the winemakers here at Lynfred because of its big, bold, interesting flavors. Now, it does have a lot of tannin as well, so that's part of the reason that Cabernet Sauvignon is added. Cabernet Sauvignon does have quite a bit of tannin, but it's also a little bit more elegant and nuanced in its flavor profile than the Petite Syrah. With Cabernet Sauvignon, we have this interesting kind of herbal and vegetal component that we'll get to when we smell it. Do want to do a quick sidebar and explain, most people are accustomed to 100% pure Cabernet Sauvignon. In fact, it is the most popular grape in the world and the most widely planted, but historically, it was featured pretty much only in blends, in that same famous Bordeaux blend, like I mentioned with the Petit Verdot. The reason Cabernet Sauvignon is added to the Bordeaux blend is the same reason that it's added here to our Assemblage. Provides a little bit of balance for its elegance in comparison to the Petite Syrah, and then those interesting vegetal and herbal notes, of course, add complexity to the flavor as well. The Syrah is also going to add balance and complexity because, like the Petit Verdot, Syrah has a prominent floral aroma to it, and it's also adding balance to our wine here because, like I said, Petite Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon are a little bit more on the tannic side, whereas Syrah is a little more delicate, a little bit lighter. Let's finally smell and taste all this delicious complexity and balance. A lot of bold fruit flavors. Blackberry that's coming a lot from the Cabernet Sauvignon. One other interesting thing that's coming from the Cabernet Sauvignon, I want to see if you can focus in and pick out kind of a green bell pepper smell. That was that interesting vegetal aspect that I said was there with Cabernet Sauvignon. Don't worry if you can't quite pick it out because we do only have 38% Cabernet Sauvignon here, but next time you're enjoying a pure Cabernet Sauvignon, I invite you to try to pick out that unique characteristic. So we have definitely a little bit of a floral aroma coming from the Syrah, as I mentioned, using the same color trick. These are still, I'd say, in the sort of purple flower color category, so violet, lilac, and then definitely some of the toasted vanilla notes are coming through from the oak, and then that kind of dark chocolate espresso quality from the Petite Syrah. So let's enjoy a sip. Wow. Definitely rich and complex. Probably the most on the tannic side. We're all within the realm of balance here, but a little more acidic on our first wine, then kind of right in the middle. And then our Assemblage blend is a little more on the tannic side. Back to the other flavors that we're tasting here. So a lot of that blackberry, then the cocoa and chocolate from the Petite Syrah, and a little bit of that floral component is coming through in the taste from the Syrah. So we already noted the wonderful complexity of this wine, and I noted that in terms of balance, it is a little bit more on the tannic side of the spectrum, but that gives me a chance to tell you that the really cool thing about learning about wine isn't that you can, explain all these technical terms to your friends or whatever, although I invite you to do that if you want. The cool thing is learning the correct usage of these structural terms allows you to better understand what your tastes are and go out and find more delicious wine suited to your tastes. So maybe you prefer a little bit more of this tart mouth-watering aspect that we were getting from the Touriga. So you can go seek out wines that are a little bit more on the acidic end of the spectrum as opposed to tannic. So Pinot Noir is definitely going to be in this camp, as well as Beaujolais, which is a really nice juicy French varietal that I recommend for summer. Or if you're learning that you like a little bit more of that structured mouthfeel coming from the tannins, go out and enjoy yourself a pure Petite Syrah. In fact, I highly recommend our 2013 Reserve Petite Syrah. It's literally probably one of the best wines I've ever had. So if you're enjoying that tannic feeling, I recommend that wine as well as other Petite Syrahs. Zinfandel as well is going to be in that category. Again, it's all about discovering why you like what you like and learning how to go find more of it. Something I know everybody likes is food and wine pairing, and I want to invite you to sort of deepen your understanding of the principles involved in food and wine pairing, utilizing some of these structural terms that I've had a chance to explain today. So the most important aspect of a wine structure that's going to influence our choices when it comes to food and wine pairing is tannin. Of course, as we've thoroughly explained, tannin is that aspect of a wine that makes your mouth feel dry. And when you have this dialed up to the extreme, it's not necessarily super pleasant when you're just sipping on a wine. Imagine like Chianti, which for me gives me that like sandpaper tongue feeling if I'm drinking it just on its own. But with food, it's an entirely different story. So think of that tannin as drying our mouth out because it's like cutting through the saliva. In the same way, if you're enjoying a rich, juicy, maybe kind of fatty meat, the tannins are going to have the effect of cutting through all that richness making you want more meat, making you want more wine. Delicious little cycle there. And if you, like me, don't really love Chianti on its own, I dare you to try it alongside some juicy Italian meatballs next time. But back to applying this pairing principle to our wines here. On the most tannic end of the still wonderfully balanced spectrum, we do have our Assemblage. But all these wines, I would say, have a pretty good tannic backbone to them, making all of them excellent choices to pair with any kind of rich meat, steak, brisket, ribs, any delicious red meat you can think of. Any of these wines would be a great choice for. Moving away a little bit from meat, for our non-meat eaters, I want to focus on another principle of food and wine pairing, and that is the idea of matching intensity. All of our wines here are pretty bold, and when you're pairing wine with food, you don't want the flavors, or you don't want the intensity of the wine to overwhelm the flavors of the food, and vice versa. You want to have a balance there as well. When pairing bold wines, any food that has bold flavors, like bold cheeses, blue cheese, or aged cheeses, maybe like an aged Gouda, are going to stand up to and balance the intensity of these wines. Or even roast mushroom that's covered in like a rich sauce would be an excellent pairing as well. Besides matching intensity, another food and wine pairing principle that's excellent to have in mind is matching flavors. Any standout flavors in the wine are going to be excellent to pair with a food that also has a similar flavor highlight. So achieving balance by kind of highlighting those similarities of flavor. That green bell pepper taste that was distinct that I was trying to get us to notice in the Assemblage comes to mind right away. So a grilled steak with like grilled green peppers and jalapeno for like a steak taco sounds great right now. Or a roast beef sandwich with peppers, or leave the meat behind and you know those green bell peppers that you stuff with rice and vegetables and maybe some sauce and cheese and grill that. That would be an excellent vegetarian option for the Assemblage. In our Teroldego-Petite Syrah, some of the more prominent flavors were that black pepper, chocolate, coffee, cocoa component. So that makes me think of mole sauce. I guess I'm in the mood for Mexican. You could also pair this with something that would highlight the chocolatey flavors, like a chocolatey dessert or just pure chocolate. Who doesn't love wine with chocolate? And then our Touriga Nacional leads me to another food and wine pairing principle that I want to share with you, and it's this little slogan: what grows together goes together. So if a wine has historically developed in a region, it's historically developed alongside the cuisine of that region as well. So you can be pretty darn sure that there's a good pairing between the native wine and native cuisine of a particular region. Coming from Portugal, think of Portuguese or Spanish foods that would be good to pair with this, like chorizo, paella are definitely in accordance with that principle. And of course, all of these food and wine pairing principles apply beyond just the scope of the delicious Lynfred blends that we have here. You can use them in any food and wine pairing. Just remember, tannin balances out rich, fatty meats. You want to match intensity of the food and the intensity of the wine. You want to match flavors, and what grows together goes together. I really do hope that you enjoyed this guided virtual tasting. I hope that you deepened your understanding of all the amazing expertise and choices that go into creating a blended wine, as well as deepened your appreciation of all the structural aspects that we want to have in balance, as well as that complexity. Also, I really hope that those tips and tricks for expanding your palate were helpful, picking out fruit flavors in a more nuanced way, floral components, and then also those notes about how to tell if a wine is aged in oak. If you're interested in ordering more, many of these delicious blends featured today, or if you want to enjoy another guided tasting kit, we have 3 others for you to choose from. And of course, a whole library of amazing wines for you to discover, like that Reserve Petite Syrah I mentioned, on our website, lynfredwinery.com. And remember, Even though we might be separate, that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy a delicious glass of wine together, or 3, have a little bit of fun, and hopefully learn something in the process. Cheers, and I'll see you soon.